Hi everybody. So this is going to be our first set of notes over ecology. We're officially done with evolution. We're going to move on to ecology. So this is our last unit of the year. We're going to split this up into three parts. We're going to have a quiz over each of these, and then once we're all done going through the content, we'll have a test over all three. So this part, this PowerPoint, is going to be about the basics of an ecosystem and just important vocab that we need to know about ecology. So during this, let's see if we can get through all these points in my time limit for this recording, but these are all the topics we're going to mention today. So what is ecology? This is the study of relationships among living organisms and the interactions that organisms have with their environment. So far throughout the year, we've talked about what it means for something to be alive, right? And different components of those characteristics. And now that we have a good understanding of what it means for something to be alive, how things have evolved over time, this is talking about, okay, once we know that these organisms exist, how do they depend on each other? How do they interact with each other? This is a great picture. It shows the organization level of ecosystems generally. I have one individual, multiple of those make a population. If I have different species involved, this includes a community. Once those different species are interacting with things like rocks or water that aren't living, that creates an ecosystem. Multiple ecosystems create a biome, and then multiple biomes create a biosphere. So this is our level of organization that we'll be dealing with. Within an ecosystem, so again, an ecosystem right here is different species living with everything in its environment, okay? So within an ecosystem, everything is divided into two things. One is abiotic. These are non-living things. So things like temperature, air, sunlight, soil, everything over here on the right side of this. So that's abiotic. Other things in an ecosystem are obviously living. These are called biotic. These are going to be my plants, animals, microscopic critters, bacteria, fungi. All of these things that are considered living are going to be biotic. And when you think about it, it's easy to remember, right? Because bio means living. So biotic is living things. Abiotic is not. So let's talk about some of the abiotic things for a second. Biogeochemical cycles are our next word here or topic. Bio means living. Geo, I think of geology or earth, and chemicals are chemicals, compounds. So these cycles that we're going to be talking about are how these things are going between living things, the earth, and chemical cycles. We have covered this before, maybe not in this class, but definitely last year in physical science, but the conservation of matter states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred into different forms. So all of the atoms that make up Earth billions of years ago are actually still here. They're just transferring into these different forms and into these different types of material. So biogeochemical cycle, this is a movement, right? It's moving through a cycle of a particular chemical or compound through biological, living, and geological, like Earth, or I can say living and non-living parts of an ecosystem, right? And again, this is my biotic, abiotic. Hydraulic cycle or the water cycle. This is something that you guys learned in elementary school. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but it is an important part of ecosystems. Without this water cycle, I don't want to imagine what it would be like. It wouldn't be able to exist. So the water cycle, we obviously have these three words: evaporation, which is water going into the atmosphere; condensation, it's kind of clumping up, the water vapor is turning into liquid again; and the precipitation is water falling back to the Earth's surface. This is a little fact that you might find interesting. The fresh water consists of about 3% of all water on Earth. So there's a lot of water on Earth, right? Only 3% of that is considered fresh water. And actually, we live pretty close to a good majority of that fresh water in the Great Lakes. So those are pictures of the water cycle. Again, not going to spend too much time on it. For the oxygen cycle, we also know a bit about already. This is going to be representing how oxygen is transferring into different parts. So plants replenish a large portion of the atmospheric oxygen, right? We know that plants give off oxygen. We as animals use that oxygen. Therefore, we give off carbon dioxide, it goes back into the plants, and it's this continuous cycle. The carbon cycle. Carbon is the building block of life. Every single living thing has carbon inside of it. And this is going to be the cycle that maybe is the newest to you guys. Maybe you haven't heard too much about the carbon cycle. So this is where maybe the questions I would pick would be from the carbon cycle. So all living things need carbon. Plants use carbon through those cellular processes, which we know. Carbon can create deposits of calcium carbonate in the ocean and make large sedimentary rocks. So what that really means is not only is carbon in living things, but it's in a great deal of our rocks as well. When those rocks are buried for a long time, that carbon can be converted into fossil fuels. We as humans have discovered that if we burn these fossil fuels, it releases that carbon back into the air. And I'll talk about this on the next slide, but the amount of carbon dioxide in the air could actually affect our climate and our temperature. So this is an example of how carbon is transferring through all these different parts. We have carbon in the atmosphere diffusing into the water and back out. We have carbon going into plants. We're using carbon as animals, so that information isn't really new. But what you might want to keep in mind is that when living things, which all have carbon, once they die and they start to decompose, that carbon gets into the soil and the ground. And once it's buried for a long time, we're talking millions and billions of years, it turns into these fossil fuels like oil, coal, and other natural things. So we as humans have discovered that if we extract all of this really, really old carbon, we burn it, we use it for energy, things to power up different parts of our system. So this releases a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And maybe you guys have heard of burning fossil fuels is bad. It can be bad to an extent. The reason for that is because if you increase these emissions, you increase this continuous release of carbon into the air, it's going to raise our temperature. Climate change, right? We're going to actually talk about climate change a lot more later into this ecology unit, but this emission of carbon is definitely affecting it. So, biogeological cycles. Things are continuously cycling through different living and non-living things. My next point is called an ecological niche. This is simply an organism's role in the community. This includes what food that organism is eating, where does it live, what is it actually doing, what time of day it's active, at nighttime or daytime, what resources is it using. So an example I have here is the sunflower. The sunflower is growing in the backyard, that's its habitat. It's absorbing light, water, and nutrients, that's what it's doing. It's providing shelter and food for other organisms, and it gives off oxygen into the atmosphere. So this is basically just saying, okay, what is this organism? What is it doing in the ecosystem? How is it benefiting other things? All right. This example over here, I have this tree and there's 3 different birds and it's color coded to their habitat in this tree. Now, why do you think these birds can't live everywhere and everywhere in this tree? What would happen if both of these birds or all three of these birds actually occupied the same niche? If they lived in the same type of habitat and very similar diets, it wouldn't be that great because they would then be in competition with each other. More animals that are in competition with each other, the less resources they have. So that's another important part about a niche. Now this, you guys know about already. Autotrophs like autopilot, they create their own food. I want you guys to identify producers and autotrophs, meaning the same thing, like they're producing their own food. And heterotrophs, as you know, ingest their food. They're consuming their food. So these words, producers and consumers, are going to be new words that we haven't used in this class before. You guys also should know what this is. Types of heterotrophs. You know that herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat other animals, omnivores eat both. Decomposers are going to eat dead matter and break things down. So, energy flow in an ecosystem. So now that we know what an ecosystem is, we talked about how things are cycling through. A food chain shows how that energy flows through an ecosystem. Arrows are going to be used in these food chains to represent the direction of energy, and it only goes in one direction. Energy cannot go backwards, it can only go in one direction. And it's going to be shown from the prey pointing to the predator. Prey is what gets eaten, predator does the eating. So in other words, the autotrophs, heterotrophs. These arrows are pointing to where the energy goes. So the energy from this plant goes to the grasshopper. The energy from this grasshopper goes to the mouse, and so on and so forth. Very similar to a food web, but a little different. A food web, as opposed to a food chain, represents many interconnected food chains. So, for example, these berries. It's not that this green fly is the only organism eating these berries, right? Other organisms are able to eat it too. Other organisms are able to get energy from these berries. So we see this interconnected food web. The important thing you guys need to know about is the arrows, is that it's where the energy is going. So, within these food webs and food chains, we need to talk about certain trophic levels. This is each step in a food chain or web, and it's a stepping block, and each step is called a different trophic level. So, our first trophic level, let me get the picture up here. My first trophic level are my primary producers. Remember, producers are autotroph. They're making their food. So these are all my plants, right? My primary producers are my first step in all of these food chains and food webs. Next, I have my primary consumers. So primary means first, right? Producers means autotroph, consumer means heterotroph. So these are my first kind of heterotrophs. These are going to be the things that eat the plants. Going from there up the food chain, I have my third trophic level, which is the secondary consumers. So my second level of heterotrophs. These guys are going to be the ones that are eating my primary consumers. And there, after that, I have the tertiary consumers. These are going to be the highest. They're going to eat my secondary consumers.